Cool. Hello, everybody. I'm Alex. I'm a software engineer here. I work mostly on the website and mostly using Ruby and JavaScript. You can find me on Twitter if you want to. And I'm going to talk about Redux, why I think it's pretty cool, and when maybe not to use it. So how many of you know about Redux? Or don't know, but let's do it the other way. How many of you don't know about Redux? Okay. Cool. So if you go on the Redux repo, if you read the README, what you're going to see is that Redux is a predictable state container for JavaScript applications. So that tells you two things. One is it's something that lives outside your application to manage your data. And the other thing is it doesn't actually involve React. It's completely separate. So Redux is something that was created from Flux. It's not quite Flux, but it's some form of management, of data management solution for React. And it was really influenced by Elm. It was created last year. And initially, the point was to demonstrate that you could have hot reloading with time travel in React applications. So we're going to talk about that later during the talk. So in practice, Redux, in terms of flow, looks like this. You have immutable state, which is outside your application. You inject it onto your component, or you inject a subset of your state onto your component, and your component is able to dispatch actions that go through reducers, and those reducers transform the immutable state, and so on and so forth. It's some form of a Flux implementation, so it's a one-way data flow. It only goes in one direction. The component is not going to modify the state, and the reducer is not going to impact the component directly. What does it actually look like? So what you're going to do is you're going to write reducers. Reducers are functions that take the current state of the application. They take a message, which is an action, and based on this action, they will modify the state on it, and they will do it in an immutable way. So for instance, here we have a to-do reducer, of which the initial state is an empty array. And it will respond to the add to-do action by adding a to-do to the array and returning a new array. So I haven't shown it here, but what you will do is you will take those reducers and connect them to a store. So each reducer will map to a key on your application state. So in this case, we have state.todos, where state is your application state. So initially, it's an empty array. Then you will dispatch an action, an add to the action, for instance, and as a result, your state.todos will now be buy milk. So on one side, you have data, and on the other side, you have your components. So that's just React. But what you will want to do is to write your components as dumb as possible. You just want them to be functions of data. They don't have state, they're not smart, they don't know how to manipulate the data. In this example, for instance, you have a very simple functional component that takes to-dos and an add to-do function and displays the to-dos in a list item. And there is input and a button, and if you click on the button, it will add a to-do, but the component doesn't know anything about how to add the to-dos or this kind of stuff. It's completely separated from the actual logic of your data. So you have the data on one side and you have the views on the other side, and you will connect the two using a connect function, which is coming from another package, not from Redux, but from React bindings for Redux. This function lets you do two things. First, you will specify which part of your application state you want to inject on the component. So for instance, in this case, I'm taking the entire application state, I'm taking the state.todos, and I'm injecting it on the component as the to-dos part. The second thing it lets you do is inject functions that will allow the component to dispatch actions. So in this case, for instance, the component will receive the add to-do function, and if it calls the add to-do function, it will dispatch the action. And then you call connect on the component, and then you have what is called in Redux lingo a container, as opposed to a component, which is dumb. So as you've seen, the data and the components are as separate as possible. Everything is encouraged so that your components are as dumb as possible. They're literally just functions that take input as data, data as input, and outputs HTML. So if you want to test these components, it's really simple. You don't have to worry about where the data is coming from, if you have to get it on a REST API, if it's asynchronous. You just care about what the inputs are for the functions, and if you have user interactions, you can just pass them spy functions. You don't care about the actual functions. So, for instance, if you use an enzyme with chai, you will just take an array of to-dos and a spy function, and you will pass them as props to a component, and you can test that there actually is the HTML that you expect. Or if you click on the button, it will actually call the function. So you don't really have to stub anything. You don't have to pretend that some stuff is something different. You just test the component as it is, which is just an input-output function. On the other side, you also want to test that your data behaves the way it's supposed to. So you want to test the reducers. The good thing is that the reducers are just functions. So if you want to test them, you will just call them and test that the output is actually what you want. It doesn't get any simpler than this. So for instance, here we test that the initial state is what we want it to be, which is an empty array, and that if you call it with an add to do action, it adds the action to the array. It's as simple as that. Another thing for which Redux is pretty good is for performance. So React is already pretty fast. Like, I don't think anyone really cares about performance of frameworks anymore. Like, they all render really fast. And usually when I have performance issues, because I'm not doing things properly. So in React, it usually means that we're re-rendering the virtual DOM too much. So in these scenarios, what you do, you use should component update, and you check that the props are the same as the one before. If they are the same, you don't re-render, you stop the rendering chain, and that's about it. With Redux, what's really easy is that, what's really great is that everything is immutable. So if something changes in your state, it's a new object. So it's really easy to check if something has actually changed. So Connect does that automatically. It will always look at what subset of data you want to inject, compare it with the previous one, and not re-render. So out of the box, you already get a lot of pretty good performance. So here I've given an example. If I want to take the list item from the previous example and make it a container, I can connect it to the actual to-dos in the array, identify with the index in the array. And if I add a to-do to the array will be different. It will re-render the previous container because it's a new array. But this will not be re-rendered because it's still the same underlying object inside the array. So of course, this is kind of a trivial example, but it gets really helpful very quickly when you have very complex components and pretty deep component tree. If you care about performance, with Redux, you're going to want to think about what data you inject. So in the previous example, for instance, we're injecting just one to-do, not the entire thing. It's very easy to just inject everything and let React deal with it, but sometimes it leads to performance issues. And maybe you're going to want to have small connected components that are connected to smaller part of your state. Another thing where Redux is pretty good is developer experience. So that's why it was created in the first place. With Redux, you get hot reloading in a very advanced way. So hot reloading, for those that don't know, is if you use Webpack, so I don't think it works with that Webpack, but if you change a file in your code, it will reload this particular file without reloading the entire application. With Redux, because the state is actually separate from your component, you do not lose the state. It doesn't reset the state of the component, which is pretty good. So you also have time travel. So because everything that happens in your application is just a succession of actions, you can easily record what happens in terms of user interactions, and you can go back, and you can go forward, and it's pretty cool. But in practice, it's not that useful. And then you have DevTools. You have several of them, but one of them is pretty cool and lets you log all the actions that go through your applications. And for each action, you will be able to see what the action was and what actually was the impact on the state and what the state is at the end. You can also export the state, so you can share it or create tests based on that. It's pretty powerful. So if you use Redux, you get easy testability because of the way it encourages you to separate your data and your component. You get pretty good performance because everything is immutable out of the box. You get good dev tools, but I think the best thing about Redux is simplicity. As a start, the reduces the just functions. Like if you look at previous Flux implementation or other data management systems, like you often have classes and they extend from certain kind of stores, and it's fairly complicated. In this case, it's really just functions. So it's really easy to reason with, and it's really easy to test. The logic underlying Redux is fairly simple. And you can just read the library code, and it's very easy to read. If you look at, for instance, I have never read the data binding part of the Angular code. It's probably very complicated. This is very simple. So if you have any issues, it's very easy to understand where they're coming from. It's very easy to debug them. It's also very easy to extend everything that's going on. By default, so the code is simple. The code you write with it is simple, and it doesn't do much. So it lets you extend it to work exactly the way you want. So you can add middlewares that will let you encompass common behaviors, or you can write store enhancers that do more complex stuff. But in the end, what's really important is that you are in control of how you use the library and what it does with your data. So essentially, you can bring your own conventions, and it will work the way you want it to work. But that's also kind of an issue, because you have to bring your own conventions, they are your responsibility. You have to do it. If you don't say, this is how I'm going to handle asynchronous stuff, then in your code, as it grows, you're going to have 5 different ways of doing it, and you have to set a way of doing it and forcing it. So you can use middlewares, for instance, but you have to decide on something. Also, because it's simple and doesn't do magic, there's a lot of boilerplate. So you've seen at the beginning there was a switch statement. I think everybody here hates switch statements. You can remove them, but then you have to write more code and you have to make more decisions. In the end, it's an investment. Out of the box, it doesn't do much, but if you invest the time into it, it will do a lot of things. So, should you use it? If you like being in control of exactly how the data works in your application, and if you care about the simplicity of the tools that you use, yes. If you have a very big application with different components and state that is shared across different components, and each component modify them, then it's probably a good idea. But on the other side, if you're just trying to build a small applications or a prototype, it's probably not necessary. And most of all, you should not start with Redux. There's been a lot of debate recently about how every single React introduction now uses Redux to manage the state. This is not necessary. You need to make sure that you understand exactly how, you need to make sure you master React before introducing anything else, obviously. And you need to bear in mind that set states and internal component states are useful, especially for local UI states. And also you should check out whatever else is available to manage state in React. There's something else that's come out recently and got some traction, which is MobX. It's pretty much the opposite of Redux in terms of concepts. Everything is immutable. Everything is using decorators everywhere. The underlying code is probably very complicated. And it does a lot of magic, but it works pretty well. So you need to know what you want to use in the end. That's it. Thanks for listening. Do you have any questions? I think we have 5 minutes.
Si vous voulez poser les questions en français et qu'on les traduise, si vous voulez poser les questions en français tout simplement, en fait, pas de problème.
Moi j'ai une question sur le shoot component update. En fait, on n'a plus besoin de mettre ce que j'ai passé là. Pour le fait d'utiliser Redux et de connecter le composant, c'est qu'on n'a plus besoin de s'occuper de ça. C'est un peu bizarre.
So I should translate it.
Yeah, repeat the question.
Okay, I'll just repeat the question in English. So can we really not use shoot component update anymore? Do we really not need it anymore? Well, I found from using Redux on a fairly complex application that you don't actually need it, because the places where you would need it are the places where you connect the data into your component and it already does it. So it will not re-render if it's not necessary. So sometimes you need to do it, because the cases where I found that I needed to use it were the ones where I hadn't designed the connection between the state and the component correctly. Like it was injecting too much data. So other changes were impacting and creating re-renders, but I haven't felt the need for it. I had some performance issues related to that, and I had something else where I needed to change a store enhancer. It was so you can extend Redux in 2 ways. You can build middleware, which are in the middle when you dispatch actions, and you can create store enhancers, which change the way components are notified about changes in the state. So, for instance, it was fairly easy to say to throttle the number of times the components are updated when the state is updated. So I had an issue where the state was modifying too often, but it was very easy to just re-render the component every 16 milliseconds instead of every time. So again, you could improve the performance without actually changing your code and without using shoot component update. Anything else? Yeah.
Did you use sometimes Redux with GraphQL?
No. So the question was, have I used or have we used GraphQL with Redux? The answer is no, I've never used GraphQL. It looks really good, but I think there's a lot of investment on your backend that not only. Yeah. I'm not entirely sure. I've never used it. Is the answer.
Okay. No, I just wanted to know if there is some opportunities or some code specifics about using GraphQL with Redux.
It's a good question, but I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, one last question.
It should be more better library. So can I use that with different things like React?
Yes. So it is a library. Like it comes with a store. Like we've not seen the store, but there's a store. You never actually interact with it, but at the beginning you need to create it. There's the connect function. Sorry. So yeah, if you don't look at the connect function, there is a library which is very simple, which is called Redux, and then you have bindings. Initially, you have the React Redux binding, which lets you connect Redux to React. But there's one for Angular 1, Angular 2, Vue.js, and I know that Vue.js also has another kind of library, which is like Redux. You can use that with everything.
Thanks. We'll move to the next speaker. Thank you, Alex.